Hello, everyone. We are back for 2026. It feels like we've been away for a lifetime. We've enjoyed some relaxation and rest, but in the interim, the world has still been turning, and what a lot has happened. So, to get straight into it, I'm going to introduce my co host, the editor of The Shot, Dave Milner. Dave.
G'day, Joe. G'day, everybody. Did we pick like the most unhinged month ever to take off from doing this? It's insane what's been happening.
It is absolutely insane. It's been keeping all of us both stressed out and on our toes. So to unpack everything, well, not everything that's been happening since December last year, because then we'd have one of those kind of Joe Rogan length discussions, and I really think an hour is long enough for all of us to keep banging on. But we have legal expert and resident ratbag Michael Bradley joining us for our first show of the year. Michael, hello.
Hello.
And giving us her expertise on all things international, we have the Australia Institute's Emma Shortis. Emma, hello.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Wow. Well, look, I think one of the things we do first need to acknowledge that really just after we went off air last year, we had the horrifying events take place on December 14 in Bondi. Really just a shock for everybody in Australia. I think that such horror could come to our shores, particularly, of course, for our Jewish community. And it really cast a pall over not just Hanukkah, not just the rest of 2025, but really all of the December, January, and our polities since then. It's played out in all sorts of different ways, but before we get into any of them, I think we just have to acknowledge the human tragedy and suffering that has resulted from it, and nobody can detract from really that great tragedy that has happened. I will also acknowledge that after such a great national tragedy, it was quite unprecedented that the event itself and the suffering of our Jewish brothers and sisters was almost immediately politicised in a way which felt really very foreign as a nation mourns, to have politics so immediately injected into the aftermath and then into the analysis and discussion that happened thereafter. Backfired very badly, I think we would say, for the now former coalition, who are now traversing a familiar political wasteland. Michael, what were your thoughts on how the immediate aftermath had that really poisonous politics injected so quickly into the discussion?
I think it was awful and quite shocking because we didn't really have a precedent for. I mean, we don't really have a precedent for the incident. It's the event itself, but previously when terrible things have happened, this hasn't resulted that sort of instant turning of it into a political circus. The thing I felt most profoundly about that I think a lot of people felt was how much that must have compounded the suffering of the directly affected community and particularly the families of the victims, because there was no space for them to properly mourn or grieve. They were being dragged instantly into this political firestorm, such that so the grieving was all very performative. There were, column inches were being filled with speculation about whether Albo should or shouldn't or did or didn't turn up to which funerals or what. I just feel like if I was directly impacted by that, I would have felt so horrifically wounded by the way the whole thing was hijacked and how. Did
it feel like certain people weren't allowed to grieve this despite what they were feeling? I saw footage of can't remember her name, but an anti-Zionist Jew wearing a keffiyeh wanting to mourn and being dragged away by thuggishly fascistic cops, just not allowed near the space for public mourning.
Look, I think I can understand why kafirs were not welcome at Bondi in that immediate aftermath because of the symbol that they have become. But to me, I think it really was an unprecedented event, as Michael says, and then the way that people responded to that. And look, Susan Lee, to her credit, on the day and the day thereafter, did try and strike a conciliatory tone that recognised what was going on, but she was sort of then dragged down into the mass by the rest of her colleagues in really unfortunate ways. I think we then have also seen politicians try and respond performatively and very quickly through Parliament. And we've seen a lot of legislation pass through both the New South Wales Parliament and through the federal Parliament very quickly, it seems to me, to demonstrate that things are being done. There's a sort of a busyness around this public grieving, which some of our politicians have embraced, which doesn't necessarily seem to be dealing with any of the actual causes of the Bondi horror, but rather to mollify certain sections of the community to show that they are listening and they are responding. So, Michael, if we can come to perhaps first Minns's response and the New South Wales Parliament's response. They were recalled before the end of the year to pass anti-protest laws in particular. There was an immediate linking of the pro-Palestine protests with Bondi in a quite horrifying way by no one less than the anti-Semitism envoy, or the envoy against anti-Semitism, Gillian Segal, that cracking down on the anti-genocide marches seemed to be a reflexive response to what had happened in Bondi in ways that didn't make much logical sense.
Yeah, I think, a lot of bad law has been made in the immediate aftermath of Bondi. None of it, there's no evidence-based connection between the laws that have been made and what caused Bondi to happen. Obviously, it's way too soon to be able to do that. I think politicians were caught in a bind because the pro-Israel lobby had been dominating the sort of public space for a while. Bondi obviously placed them at the centre, and so the conversation became impossible immediately, as you'd kind of expect. Gillian Segal had already been put in a position of power and had made her demands already, which almost none of which are legally or constitutionally possible, but the immediate impetus to go, we've got to do that as a bare minimum, was sort of latched onto by politicians at state and federal level. And then, what we got was performative lawmaking, which was handing certain interest groups what they'd been demanding for a fair while anyway, without either a proper evidence base or proper time for consideration. And at the same time, certainly in the case of New South Wales, with the Minns government, which has a profoundly, authoritarian streak to it, Minns's instinct is very much against, protest activity of any kind. So he was, immediately attracted to this idea of saying, well, no protest at all if the police commissioner decides, we can't. And, in Sydney, we are still, under that regime. So now, we have this crazy situation where the police commissioner can decide that it's just not safe for anyone to have public assemblies and strip any legal protection those assemblies have for 90 days, and it can be extended and so on. Now, yeah, nobody gave it proper thought. Nobody even thought about whether it was legally or constitutionally viable, which it's not. And I hope it falls over soon. But what we've seen at both state and federal level is very similar to what we saw after 9/11.
I was going to say that because we said there wasn't a precedent for this type of incident in Australia, and that's sort of true. But there is a precedent globally of what happens after terrorist attacks in the UK, in the US, and now in Australia. And what they say is that in these times of crisis, you can't create a new plan. You reach for the plans that are already there. So allow me to be a little conspiratorial for you. This is to silence critics of Israel. They wait for the moments and they seize them. And it is having a chilling effect on the public discourse, and it is a serious threat to our civil liberties. I think we all know this. It's just difficult to say nowadays.
Certainly, yes, that is true. I think, as I said, what's been done was already being demanded. Bondi made it a fait accompli. I don't I wouldn't really apply quite that degree of cynicism to the forces pushing it. I think it became an inevitability. The fault is with the politicians, with the government, because moral panic makes bad law, and there was no need for any of this to happen as quickly as it did. It should, proper time should be given. These bills should be sent off to committee. There should be adequate time for submissions from the public and from interested groups, so that when the Parliament actually comes to consider the law, they have time and space to reflect on it and think about the consequences of what they're doing. That hasn't happened, and there's been this sort of paradigm in place since 9/11, where when it comes to national security and protest and civil liberties, they're just thrown out without a second thought as soon as the temperature goes up.
Politicians are more likely to do this if they are sort of wishy-washy centrist apparatchiks that don't actually stand for anything, don't have a historical education, have only been student politicians through to career politicians. They don't really understand the gravity of what they're playing with.
Or they do, or they're hard right, and they actually want to do. And if I can bring you into the conversation here, because it is the case, just picking up on both Dave and Michael's analogy with 9/11, is that before 9/11, Australia had really I think there was one piece of legislation in the Northern Territory legislature dealing directly with terrorism. And then since then, and there's been some great reporting in Crikey on this from Charlie Lewis over the years, is that now we have over 90 pieces of legislation on the books federally that sort of divide into two separate eras, if you like. The first 10 years were all about police powers and ASIO's powers, and just extending kind of those powers in very draconian ways. People could be just locked up for 7 days initially. I think that's the one piece of legislation that it actually has been pulled back somewhat. But the powers of interrogation, all those sorts of things. And then in the subsequent 10 years, it's been about surveillance and data retention and what kind of information can be gathered and then kept by a government on its citizens. What has been your observation about the way that this sort of apparatus and structures have built up over the decades?
I think mostly, Joe, like the rest of you, my observation would be just how dangerous it is. I spend most of my time, with US politics, of course, and that is front of mind at the moment because the Department of Homeland Security was established in 2002 in the aftermath of 9/11, and that's the department that then established the Agency of Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, which is, currently terrorizing people in Minneapolis. And we see this consistent pattern, I think, where those laws are enacted and only go one way. They only increase the powers of agencies like that, which become increasingly unaccountable. They lack transparency almost entirely. And, eventually somebody gets their hands on the levers of power around those agencies and uses them for authoritarian ends, and that's exactly what's happened in the United States. And unfortunately, because of the nature of our relationship with the United States, those patterns reinforce each other, in both of our nations, where Australia becomes enmeshed and deeply implicated in that second phase that you were talking about, Joe, in terms of intelligence and surveillance, where, Australian architecture around some of our signals intelligence is being used in NSA spying, in the architecture of American surveillance and data collection, without the knowledge or consent, really, of the Australian people. And in the age of Trump, it already raised lots of questions about our role in the world and our relationship with the United States. But in the age of Trump, that's raising some extremely pressing questions, I think, for Australia. And I think for, Australian leadership to cave to some of that, the weaponization that we've been talking about, coming from outside as well, coming from the Israeli leader, for example, is appalling. It's an appalling failure of moral leadership.
And I guess one of the really concerning things, this is a little bit of a tangent, but just because we have your expertise here, is in some ways how there is this privatisation of that data collection going on. And so you have this insinuation of kind of evil corporations like Palantir into the very heart of all of our democracies, the UK, the US, and indeed here as well. So there's this porous nature between private and public, and this complete breakdown of privacy.
Just want to jump in with a little tiny footnote that Switzerland recently declined their government's contract with Palantir. They said it was a security risk. They looked at the program and they thought it was a terrifying future for them, so they backed out. We did not. Emma.
Yeah, no, you're right to raise that, Dave, because that kind of tech sovereignty is also a really pressing question for Australia and for allies, or former traditional allies of the United States. And I think Europe is ahead of this, ahead of us on this, and has been for a long time in terms of tech and privacy and the rights of users and consumers. Because there is that very real risk that there are these relationships, these kind of symbiotic relationships now between companies, sort of shadowy companies like Palantir and the Trump administration. They're all networked in together, and they all, Palantir in particular, is just like transparently evil. Like if you listen to some of the stuff that their CEO says, like it's straight out of like your awful fascist sci-fi dreams, like quite transparently and openly. And it's not a coincidence either that, Palantir has a significant relationship with the IDF too. So again, these loops reinforce each other. And again, the nature of our relationship with the United States means at the moment that, the Australian community, the public is effectively entirely shut out of these conversations or even of knowledge of what is happening. Like that's the alliance reinforces that anti-democratic tendency. And again, in the age of Trump, it's always a problem, but in the age of Trump, it becomes a particularly pressing problem. And our government, the current government, just doesn't seem willing to even name reality, as Mark Carney would say.
Not a single Australian was asked about this, and I don't think very many of us would have chosen this. It's wholly undemocratic. It's fascist as shit.
Now, we're going to get a bit more into Trump and what is going on now with the hollowing out of NATO and Carney really deciding to bell the cat at Davos. But before we do, and before we leave the changes to laws happening here in Australia, as Michael has said, the New South Wales police in particular have been given this enormous power to just basically shut down all protests if they deem them to be unsafe, or those that are going to be on public streets anyway and that require that authorisation. And that at one point it looked like that may impact on the marches for First Nations communities on Invasion Day. In the end, some protests were able to go ahead. Dave, you were at one in Melbourne, Naarm, and you have a little package from that we will throw to you now.
I was at the Naarm protest, and we'll unpack that. But first, we'll go to some video that I took of Professor Gary Foley. I thought he gave a very powerful, very direct speech of the sort that, I don't know, establishment politicians are no longer capable of. So we'll roll that.
And science is just catching up to our old people's smarts about the old ways knowing systems they had, how they cared for country, how we're still resisting the extraction and rape of our motherlands from international governments. Stop chopping the war machine! I can say that for all my Turtle Island people. I pay my deep respects to you. And we have to honour the land, sky and sea, so we have to call out these dirty, lying scum maniacs that are taking our children's birthrights. But guess what? They're taking all of yours as well. All of your children, all their fresh water, all their fresh air, all the sacred law that is an extension of who we are as blackfellas, as the oldest living continuum on this planet.
We hear about the Nazis marching these days and the rise of the right. I think it's important for people to remember and know that Australians have, until 1988, Australians didn't really give a stuff about Australia Day. They never used to wrap themselves in flags and do all this crazy nationalistic shit. That's a product of 1988 and the great millions of dollars that Bob Hawke put into celebrating that particular day. So the rise of this, right-wing nationalism is very much a new phenomenon, and that's important to remember. But also, having seen in recent times that One Nation has now surpassed the Liberal Party in votes. This is a cautionary moment for all of us, because we need to take notice of what's happening in other parts of the world. And I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. It's important that you keep your eyes on the malignant Mango Mussolini of Mar-a-Lago. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you're not taking enough notice of what's happening in the world. And it's especially important for all you great non-Indigenous brothers and sisters who are here today supporting us. It's important that you know that these marches in Melbourne for the last 5 years have been the biggest marches of anywhere in Australia. And that says a lot. That says everything you need to know about this younger generation who organise it, but it also says a lot you need to know about the nature of this city. All Melburnians who are here should be very proud of themselves today. And in closing, it's important, as I said, to know what's going on around you. And I think my final word should be that we all should take notice of that legendary Aboriginal philosopher Mao Zedong, who said we must educate ourselves, then educate the people.
So yeah, in Naarm, Melbourne, it really was a massive turnout, as Gary was saying in that footage. More than 100,000 people. I know what 100,000 people look like. I've been to the MCG tons of times. It was from the top of Parliament down the hill to Burke Street, basically. And the thing that I thought was the thing that I wrote about that really stuck out at me was that all the Indigenous leaders that spoke, they didn't have any qualms whatsoever talking truth, linking all of this web of colonial extraction, capitalist greed, genocide. They have no qualms whatsoever stating it plain. I mean, Gary Foley quoted Mao Zedong. Like, these guys go hard. And it makes you realize how just constricted the conversation is in Australia. Even amongst progressive media, it's like light fascism versus the overt frothy stuff. So, yeah, these guys really do link all of these struggles together. It's not, their struggle is the same as the Palestinian struggle. They even mention the people in Minnesota fighting ICE. They see the links between all of this. Whereas in Western media, it's constantly siloed. All of this is separate. None of this is connected. That's how they keep a lid on it. But it was a heartening display. It was obviously a tough moment for First Nations people and people that care about First Nations people. It's a shitty day on the calendar, but these rallies made the most of it. And then we get home and we hear the horrific news about what happened in Perth and Boorloo. A attempted terrorist attack, an explosive device that failed to detonate, and basically the corporate press ignored it for most of the week.
Yeah, I mean, that was an extraordinary thing. I mean, it was a bomb that was thrown into a First Nations rally, and it was only due to the hardly uncharacteristic incompetence of some of these individuals that it did not explode and result in mass casualties. And yet there really wasn't the rush to judgment or the expressions of shock and outrage that we've seen when other communities have been at risk. Michael, I saw that you had commented that actually probably what the police were doing in WA was the better way of going about things, but it did provide a stark contrast to the response that we've seen over the past few months.
Yeah, I thought ironically, this is actually closer to a model of good policing than the norm, where there's actually time being taken to ascertain the facts and not rush to apply labels to it, which contrasts very starkly with what we've been seeing in terms of the anti-Semitism scourge since October 7, where all sorts of things have been instantly labelled terrorism incidents, including the famous caravan thing.
The Ural caravan.
Yeah, exactly. Which turned out to be, all of that, right? To me, it also it kind of raises a long-term bug of mine, which is that I actually don't think the language of terrorism has a place in the law at all, and that it was a terrible mistake importing it into our legal justice system. And creating
that it
this
should be better dealt with just through the criminal law generally, because any terrorist act is by definition also criminal. Is that what you mean?
Traditionally, violent acts are either acts of war or they're crimes, or sometimes they're both. Terrorism is this sort of nebulous middle ground that is a bit of one and a bit of the other, and it comes from the so-called war on terror notion, which was a nonsense, right? But it's that sort of that labeling has created all sorts of continuing problems and has never contributed to good outcomes. So, but I think it was fascinating to see how slow the media was. How instinctively they responded to what happened in Perth, and how they are still reporting it in qualified, watered-down terms. I saw the ABC even today, with a headline with explosive in quotes because it didn't explode, I guess. Like compared to, so yes, but I think people are noticing that the starkness of that contrast as well and going, well, that's weird.
Yeah.
It's very similar to the Nazi attack at Camp Sovereignty in the middle of last year that was just completely sort of sanitized and swerved over.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I imagine from the perspective of Aboriginal people, it's like, well, what else is new? As if we were, as if our lives were going to be treated as valuable as white people's. But it's such an indictment on us.
It is.
Society.
Is the point about the terrorism law, Michael, I'm trying to get my head around it, is it because it's just a label that is very selectively applied basically to the enemies of American empire, that's no real way to base law on?
Well, yeah, it's a word that means what you want it to mean. In the
as we've seen in the US at the moment with the domestic
terrorism.
terrorism.
About to say Trump's doing that right now.
Yeah. So it's so slippery, and the criminal law requires specificity, otherwise it becomes an instrument of tyranny. So everyone has to know when a crime has been committed, and whether you're about to commit a crime. And that's another bug I have with all these laws that have been passed. Particularly this hate group law at federal level. It's so nebulous. It's so subjective in terms, like the language is so slippery.
And it gives such huge discretionary powers as well.
Yeah. So and it's language and concepts that should never find their way into the criminal law.
Well, also under attack at the moment, it seems, is international law. Now, Mark Carney did again kind of went through the looking glass a bit, Emma, because he talked about how international law had only ever been selectively enforced and applied. And I think we all knew that, but it's refreshing to hear a world leader say that out loud. A lot of this had its genesis in the immediate past when Trump, well, I don't even know if it was Trump's decision because he just seemed to be at Mar-a-Lago watching it on TV. But when the Delta forces went in to Venezuela and just snatched away an admittedly appalling leader, but nonetheless the leader and his wife at the time, and basically brought them back. There was a rendition back to Manhattan where they're now facing drug charges. I mean, there's absolutely no basis for that in any kind of international law at all, and it is just essentially lawless thuggery.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Joe. And I think it's important to say as well that, what Michael was saying about domestic law and the erosion of that is just being kind of projected outwards. One is an extension of the other. We're encouraged, I think, by people in power to think of domestic politics and international relations as entirely separate things that don't touch each other, and that's just not true. And Trump, as he does with so many things, just makes that myth harder to sustain. And that was what was so refreshing about Carney, Joe. You're right, is that he named reality. He just said this is what is happening and acknowledged that international law was far from perfect. I mean, we knew that before Gaza, but Gaza has made that abundantly clear that international law is selectively applied, to people mostly without power. But Carney's argument was that for the most part, that bargain benefited allies of the United States, including Australia, where a stable global trading system, stable international norms, led to prosperity in places like Australia, but that bargain no longer holds. Now, Carney's far from the first person to say that, but the fact that, a white dude banker, leader of, a relatively conservative society in the way that Australia is relatively conservative, for him to stand up and say that was striking, for him to reflect back what people had been thinking for so long. But I think what the beauty of what Carney did was that he also went a step further, because he didn't just name that reality. He identified that most people don't want to live in that reality. They don't want to live in Stephen Miller's world or Donald Trump's world of thuggery and lawlessness and, might makes right and power games. Most people don't want to spend their lives, feeding the engines of war. They want to, engage in the pursuit of happiness, as our founding document of the United States suggests. And to have Carney say that, I think, was incredibly refreshing. Whether Carney's substance backs up his rhetoric, I think, is another question. In the same speech, he was talking about things like reducing corporate tax, and he's engaged in some austerity measures in Canada. He talked about being an energy superpower, which for Canada means at least partly being a fossil fuel power. So there's a lot to unpack there, but that speech has had an impact for a reason. And I think, we should all be heartened, I think, by the response to it, by the Invasion Day protests that Dave was talking about, that there is this upswell of resistance to what Trump is doing, to his assault on international law, and a recognition by communities and people, of what that means, which is not what the Australian government is busy doing. But that disjunct, I think, is becoming increasingly clear to people.
Sorry, Dave.
I'm finding so difficult right now and stressful and existentially depressing is that, yes, there is this massive resistance, this massive uprising. I used to work for a Minnesota-based magazine. I'm texting these guys. I'm worried about them. They're good people. And this is global, absolutely. But no matter what, the establishment is just saying no, and they're pressing down, and they are further eroding our democratic freedoms. It's feeling increasingly rigged around these parts.
Look, I think, Dave, that's what's really concerning about what's happening in Minnesota at the moment, because Trump's, withdrawal of Bovino, the head of Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and a few other things that look like they might be concessions to protest are probably not that. It's probably Trump doing what he always does and sort of recalibrating, redirecting people's attention, but the crackdown hasn't stopped. His commitment to that policy has not gone away. And the danger is that protest movement, which is gaining so much momentum, is so organised and is so impactful, is, deliberately dispersed, which is what they're trying to do, I think, and they're very practiced at it. So that I think is deeply concerning. But there's I don't think there's an inevitability about the way that it goes. There are significant points of weakness in the Trump administration as well.
Mm-hmm. And they have just declared a national strike for Friday, which will have passed by now. And Bruce Springsteen wrote a song for Minnesota. That makes a difference.
Bruce Springsteen and Billy Bragg in the same.
That's cool. I haven't seen those yet.
I mean, it's sort of an interesting thing, isn't it, the way that Trump approaches these things, because he wants this incredibly porous border for America to go out and kind of turn neighbours into vassal states. I mean, let's not forget they're currently now just seizing all of the Venezuelan oil, selling it and salting away the proceeds into bank accounts in Qatar. I mean, it's just kind of incredible and unremarkable in these days. So pour us out and yet closed for certain people from within, and then we'll be trying to expunge, black and brown people, essentially. I mean, who knows what is going to take place? And I am full of fear of what might take place in Ohio, where the Haitian community are facing the expiry of their temporary protection status in literally 2 days' time from when you're viewing this. And then I just think he's going to set the goons on them there. And so it is, as you say, Emma, there is this symbiotic relationship between what they're doing internationally and what they're doing domestically, which is essentially fascistic thuggery.
Yeah, that's what it is, Joe. And they've been transparent as well about projecting that outwards, not just in what you were talking about in the kind of imperial revival that Trump is overseeing, but in directly interfering in the domestic politics of the United States' former allies. J.D. Vance said as much in Munich, I think it was the start of last year, where he said, the United States will effectively support far-right parties in those countries. And they've outlined that as well in the new national security strategy. So they're transparent about it and about what they see as in their interests, which is really concerning. And I think, Europe, for obvious reasons, is waking up to that reality and naming that reality, I think, in advance of Australia doing it. perhaps because it feels closer, the
Will we,
urgency
though?
is greater.
Do you think we will?
I wish I knew the answer to that, James.
I mean, I think
Well, that's
they were kind of Europe was sort of forced to do it after Greenland, and where it really seemed that there may be some kind of imminent invasion of Greenland. So the European NATO allies rallied around Denmark in that instance, talking about interfering in former allies' politics. We've just heard in the last couple of days that Trump officials are meeting with leaders of the secession movement in Alberta, Canada, really just trying to foment trouble. So people are having to bell the cat and take these things seriously. But as we note, Michael, here in Australia, it's just business as usual. Let's have a few more billions handed over for the AUKUS kind of program.
Yeah. I think our government is starting to look more and more like a shag on a rock. As everyone else starts throwing some truth bombs. Albo's language and demeanour are so firmly stuck in just parroting what Australian governments have been saying about the US forever, our shared values, and I'm not going to do running commentary on someone else's whatever. I think it's exposing him personally as an incredibly weak leader, and I think that's how most Australians are beginning to perceive him, as a pretty hollow entity himself, incapable probably of stepping up to what is required at this moment, as he failed to do in response to Bondi, because he just didn't have it in him to know instinctively, what to say and how to say it. He doesn't at the moment know what to say, so he's sort of clinging to the wreckage of a paradigm that is now well past its use-by date, supported by his able Deputy Prime Minister. And the one I do feel sorry for Penny Wong still, although my sympathy is diminishing, because she can do the honourable thing and resign instead of continuing to say things that she knows are just patently wrong.
Pretty wrong whatsoever. Also, when you mentioned Albo's demeanour, were you referring to the selfie with Trump? Because that's the first image that flashed into my mind.
I mean, that's going to haunt him for a long time. I think his much vaunted transactional political instincts, which have played well for him in domestic politics, and he's also been incredibly lucky to have the worst opposition ever
ongoing.
But his transactional political instincts are very strong, and he plays politics domestically well. But I think he's just increasingly been caught out by the circumstances, and which are becoming increasingly extraordinary. And he has no equipment for how to respond to that, how to step up into that. I think we're about to. I think we're about to see a very real worked example of that with the the catastrophic error he's made in inviting Herzog.
Herzog here,
to Australia.
I will come back to that, but can I just ask you, Emma, just on this sort of point? We've seen Greg Moriarty just be announced as the new ambassador to Washington. So long-term leader in the Defence Department, so deeply embedded within AUKUS thinking. Would your assessment be that is why he has been appointed, in order to try and keep AUKUS moving along, even as everything else is this smoking ruin? And will that work? Is there any hope that reality at some point will be recognised by this government?
I mean, I think we always have to have hope, don't we, Jo? The alternative is despair, and I'm not ready for that yet. Look, I think there can be no other conclusion about Moriarty's appointment. That it's a clear statement of priorities around the defence relationship, and I imagine AUKUS, the AUKUS submarine deal in particular, and in that a statement of priorities. This appointment has been made in the face of Trump's assault on international law in Venezuela, in Greenland and the domestic rule of law at home, that this gives us every indication that the Australian government is just going to continue down the same path and is still desperate, quite obviously, to keep AUKUS afloat. I think that's probably the wrong metaphor to use with submarines, but you know what I mean. And if that's your frame, of reference, then Moriarty will probably do a very good job. That's what he's been appointed to do, and he will probably execute it very well. The risk, of course, is that what does that framing, what does that prioritization do to the rest of the relationship? It turns it potentially, as you said, Joe, into a smoking ruin. It undermines everything else about the relationship, particularly those shared values that Michael identified, which do exist. I think it's important to say that, and we've talked about this before, the reason, or part of the reason, that we're so concerned about what's happening in the United States is because we feel an affinity with Americans. We're worried about American democracy and what its collapse might mean for Americans and for us. And the government is just obviously unwilling, unable, whichever one it is, maybe a bit of both, to face those questions. And that is deeply worrying, leaves us deeply exposed, because it also seems to be based on this idea that, if we just keep our heads down, if we just keep handing over the money, if we just keep our wallet open, Trump will leave us alone and we won't be exposed to his worst instincts. But he keeps showing us that it doesn't matter what you give him. Yeah. It's never enough. Starmer has tried the same thing. He's turned on Starmer for, very unclear reasons, I think, even to Starmer. He will do that in an instant, with a rush of blood to the head. And so the idea that you can just kind of keep pretending everything will be fine really, to me, defies all the evidence. When you could be putting your energy into insulating yourself against the inevitable coming of those worst instincts and finding allies who are also deeply worried about this. Mark Carney showed us that other countries, other traditional allies of the United States, are looking for security in numbers, so it's not like we have to do this alone. Like, we're always, the insistence is always that it's either America or it's abandonment, or it's either America or it's China. And I think Australians understand that it's not that straightforward, that we're not only faced with two bad choices, that we do have the kind of power, the kind of agency that Mark Carney was talking about. We just have to be brave enough to choose to use it. And it's very clear that this government is not willing to be brave.
Do you think Albanese's worried they'll bomb Canberra and then helicopter him out into New York City and then parade him on the back of a police van around the streets like they did with Maduro if he shows some spine?
Well, I don't want to be too glib, Dave, but I think part of the big problem with Australian foreign policy is they're not worried about that because they're convinced that, we're a like-minded white country and Trump won't do that to us. Genuinely. And I don't.
Values we never define. They happen to be capitalism and white supremacy.
Well, I mean, if you're looking at the Trump administration, it's hard to come to any other conclusion.
Yeah. Look, we're going to try and keep this year's episodes to closer to an hour because, as I say, I don't know that you need to have us banging on for much longer than that. But just to your point, Michael, Albanese has yet another big potential crisis looming, self-created, with this gesture of unity, which he's trumpeting by inviting the president of Israel to visit. And it seemed to be a sort of a knee-jerk response again when he just didn't know what to do after Bondi, and so thought, I know, I'll invite the president of Israel to come. Does there anything more beyond that? I mean, I don't quite understand what he thought he was doing when he made that decision.
I mean, I assume someone asked him to or insisted that he do it, and he, and it may have been, a not very well thought out reflex. But it is shaping up as potentially a massive own goal. One of the, Sophie Scomp's broke cover today and has called for the invitation to be rescinded. And she represents a very suburban Sydney teal seat, and so that's saying something about sentiment on the ground to the extent that people are noticing at all. that, it's definitely a sniff test or pub test moment, this one, where I think, most people, engaged or unengaged, are going to be like, really?
And why? I mean, it's...
Yeah, and why? Like, why are we inviting the head of another state to come out to mourn Australians' death? But more
let alone
particularly
the president of that state at the
that
moment.
state, whose public commentary has been cited in the International Court of Justice as a reason, as part of the basis for finding that genocide, may be being committed. I mean, I don't think on this podcast there's any disagreement that genocide is being or has been committed, but as a matter of international law, that's yet to be established. But his fingerprints are all over it, and why? Like, when Albo put out a statement today saying, the reason we did it, something like, is because we're all about unity. That this is all in the service of, our big push for unity. It's like, come on.
Are they selling those F-35 parts for unity as well?
I mean,
it's like no one believes this shit.
I mean, why are you dropping a hand grenade in the pond?
Yeah, well, exactly.
Well, we'll get to whether it's illegal to or not. There will be protests against this on the evening of Monday, the 9th of February. That will happen.
Yeah, that's shaping up to happen widely. Okay, now we are going to wind up this section of the show because Dave is going to interview Nick Hanna from the Wheres and the Whys. What's the name of his fabulous podcast, Dave?
I know him as a lawyer, not a YouTuber, so I'm going to need to look that one up. But I'm about to interview him, and we'll end the show with it. He's taking on the Chris Minns government over these laws in court, so we'll see how that goes.
So we'll throw to that. But before we do, I'm going to ask if there's any top tips. It can be for the coming week, or it can even be for the year that is about. Well, we're already through January. So, but for the rest of 2026. Michael, is there anything that's caught your eye you'd like to highlight?
I feel very strongly that the litmus test for the future of the United States and the world is the November midterm elections. They're either going to happen or they're not. And I think the temptation for Trump to not have them is going to be incredibly strong, and my feeling is he's going to not do it.
He's going to try and not do it. Well, it was very concerning that they sent in the FBI to Fulton, Georgia, to take away ballots from the 2020 election to try and sort of relitigate, but now by tampering with the evidence. And the officials there have said, with that, the evidence now compromised, they cannot guarantee the integrity of any of the material that Trump goons have just taken away. So who knows what public commentary will come out about that. Emma, any top tips from you?
A related one, I think, Joe. It's the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence this year, and there will be a lot of pomp and ceremony and magnification of that. But I cannot recommend highly enough Don Watson's new book called The Shortest History of the United States. It is extraordinary, even when, like me, you might be sick of thinking about the US a little bit. It's a wonderful book and such a reminder of the way that Trump is one of the logical conclusions, I think, of American history. It's really an extraordinary piece of writing.
Oh, great. Well, get on to that, people. Dave, anything from you you'd like to highlight?
I preemptively did it before, impatiently, when I said that on Monday.
Oh, you did. Yes, you did.
There will be huge protests against Isaac Herzog being here. So
okay, well, there we go. Get involved in that. Thank you, everyone. Also, get involved in giving us some cash if you feel like it.
We have new T-shirts.
We've got new T-shirts.
I just mailed them out. I'm sorry, some of those took a while. I was trying not to think about anything at all.
Which, with the way your mind works, Dave, I'm sure was incredibly difficult. But thank you, everybody, for joining us again in 2026. We will be back next week. Don't turn off. Watch Dave's interview with Nick, and then we'll see you next Sunday.
You're joined by Nick Hanna, criminal lawyer and YouTuber nowadays. You have a big fight ahead of you right now. You are on behalf of, I suppose, Australian democracy, challenging Chris Minns in court over these anti-protest laws. My background is not law. My background is political science, journalism, philosophy. And under that framework, I would describe these laws as fascistic. How would you describe these laws as a lawyer?
Yeah, probably won't do my clients any favors by calling the laws fascistic, even though they might. But these are laws that certainly undermine our civil liberties and I think fundamental democratic rights that people perhaps take for granted in this country. And they are, for reasons that I'm sure we'll discuss, very alarming.
There is I guess, a growing sense of alarm. People are noticing patterns across Western Anglo democracies. Dissent against the genocide in Gaza is being curtailed. We are seeing this in the UK. We are seeing support for Palestine action outlawed. Do you think this is the thrust behind these laws?
I wouldn't say it's the thrust, but it's probably accelerated a process that's been underway for a long time. It was long the case before October 2023 that the Zionist lobby was seeking to silence criticism of Israel. In fact, that's been arguably its principal function in this country for many decades. And it does that in a variety of ways. Perhaps most relevantly for today's discussion, it seeks to influence, to put it very neutrally, the state and federal governments, and often the local governments as well, to introduce laws or policies that essentially criminalize or restrict in other ways criticism of Israel. And to give you an example, before the genocide in Gaza had even commenced in October 2023, there had long been a push for promotion of the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement here to be limited, and support for the BDS movement to be restricted and sometimes criminalized. And we have seen support for resistance organizations, that is, groups in occupied Palestine and in South Lebanon, for example, which primarily exist to seek to liberate their lands from the Israeli occupation. The lobby here has worked tirelessly and very effectively and has succeeded in effectively criminalizing any form of material support or advocacy that people here can engage in support of those organizations. And so what we've seen since October 2023 is an acceleration of that process, and that's a result of the huge groundswell in popular support for Palestinians, for Palestinian justice, and opposition to not only Israel's genocide, but increasingly opposition to Israel itself, to the idea of Zionism, a recognition, a growing awareness in the public that Zionism is a form of racism, okay, because it necessarily involves the existence of an ethno-state, a Jewish supremacist state, where the indigenous people of that land, the Palestinians, are denied their fundamental rights, including their fundamental right of return. And so as there has been this enormous increase in public awareness about Israel, and that inevitably leads to an increased opposition to Israel, because I think every decent person, once they're actually aware of what Israel does and what Israel means, they are aware of it, unless they've got serious problems. Then as that opposition has increased, the Israel lobby has needed to intensify its efforts to seek to reverse that trend. And it knows that it can't win in the court of public opinion. It knows that it's lost, the battle of ideas. And so it needs to resort to its perhaps, what's always been its favorite tactic, and that is pressuring the government to criminalize or otherwise restrict a speech in support of Palestine and in opposition to Israel and Zionism.
I think lots of Australians are noticing that there are perhaps limits to their freedoms, or implied freedoms, as we sometimes talk about, that we hadn't butted up against so
directly before. As you say, the movement against this is massive. We saw hundreds of thousands of people on the Harbour Bridge, and the state response is to just quash this dissent rather than to listen to it, to reach out to it. Chris Minns did say, he said, and it caused global media attention, that Australians didn't necessarily have the rights to free speech, that there were implied rights here. Do you want to tackle that murky web a little bit and what that means for people that live in New South Wales?
Sure, and I'll try not to get too bogged down in the detail. But in short, he's right. We don't have a constitutionally enshrined right to free speech in the same way that they do have in the United States. And what we have here is a very limited form of freedom of speech, if you can even call it that. It's the implied freedom of political communication, which has severe limitations, and it's for that reason that our ability to freely express our political opinions is much more curtailed than what you see in the United States. But I think the controversy about what Min said is not that he was saying something that was necessarily inaccurate from a legal perspective, but the fact that he was saying it with glee. The fact that he was very proud of the fact that people don't have the ability to freely communicate politically here in the same way that they do in the US and some other countries. And I think that people who aren't aware of this, this lack of a right that we have here, or the limitations on our freedom of speech legally, found that quite abrasive or confronting, because I think there is this sense, at least in, Western liberal democracies, that we have freedom of speech. And I think people just assume that, not knowing that technically that's not the case. And that's why there's long been this push for, an introduction of a Bill of Rights or some other legislation, or amending our constitution so that we have greater freedom when it comes to our ability just to communicate about political matters. And unfortunately, that movement has been, it seems at the moment, it's not in a good position, and the needle shifted in the other direction. We are now in a situation where we are seeing even the very limited freedom of expression that we had prior to October 2023. We've seen that Overton window effectively been continually narrowed, and now it's getting to the point where many legal experts, including myself, are concerned that the ability just to say what I believe are uncontroversial truths — Zionism is a form of racism, Israel is carrying out a genocide in Gaza, Israel is an apartheid state, Palestine should be free from the river to the sea. These are now statements that can see you potentially arrested, charged, and facing jail time.
I mean, obviously, we have a very similar political perspective, a historical perspective on the situation. But I mean, to be clear, it sounds like they're trying to make the truth illegal.
Well, that's, I mean, of course, yes, I think that's a fair way to describe it. The truth, of course, people can disagree about what the truth is, and to be very clear, I believe that we should have the right to communicate our opinions regardless of whether I think it's the truth or not. And many of the most important cases involving freedom of speech in various countries around the world have often involved speech that I'm fundamentally opposed to, but I staunchly support the right of those people to say it. And I think that's crucial for people to understand here. Whilst I'm someone who believes very strongly in the right of Palestinians to have justice and to have freedom, that is not the sole reason why I'm so passionate and active in relation to these issues. I think that really the future of our democracy is at stake here. And I think that people are starting to wake up to that. You don't have to be someone who supports the Palestinians, even though, of course, think you should, but you don't have to be someone who supports the Palestinians in order to be deeply concerned and strongly opposed to these anti-free speech laws that are being introduced at the state and federal levels.
I think just a little tiny bit of information I want to add is that even though Americans do have a enshrined Bill of Rights, that is not protecting them at this present moment from state tyranny, state oppression, state violence to quash their dissent as well.
Yeah. So look, I'm not an expert in American constitutional law, but I think I would say this in response to that. Probably the difference there is that America is actually, and I don't. This is something that it's a word that has been overused by, I think, many on the left. If I'm frank, that is the word fascism, and I think we're very quick to call certain governments or certain policies or politicians fascist. And we're not always using it literally. We're often just using it figuratively. But I think it's safe to say that America certainly is on the trajectory now towards real fascism. And when there's real fascism in place, then yes, bills of rights don't really matter. But that's not to say that Bill of Rights hasn't served an incredibly important function in the past. America's, as is most of the West, we're now entering into uncharted territory, right? We're in genuinely unprecedented times, and so legal protections that existed and that we perhaps took for granted in the past are now becoming less and less relevant as governments become more and more emboldened to act without regard for the rule of law, and that's what we're seeing in the US. But I don't think that, and I'm not suggesting that this is what you were saying, but I don't think that that is a reason why we shouldn't really be pushing for, and why we wouldn't benefit from a Bill of Rights in this country.
No, I agree entirely. I suppose my point was without that, we'd be potentially prime for even more state violence without that sort of thing, was where I was going with
Yeah.
that.
Yes. Yeah. Agreed.
The hate speech laws, quote unquote, that are being pushed through the federal government, the Albanese government, it's a concern in the community amongst people I speak to that these will be extremely selectively applied. Is that a valid concern for Australians to have?
I would go a step further. I would say that it would be extremely naive for us to think that the hate group regime is going to be applied in a neutral or impartial manner. I think it's inevitable that it will be applied based purely on political considerations. And why do I say that? Well, I think it's very instructive to look at how the terrorism organization prescription regime has operated over the past 20 plus years. Whilst the test for being prescribed a terrorist organization is, of course, neutral, that is to say, the law doesn't require an organization to have any particular ideology, such as an Islamist ideology, in order for you to be prescribed as a terrorist organization. When you look at the list of organizations that have been prescribed over the past, say 25 years, there are currently, I think, 31 organizations. You can see the list of them on the Australian National Security website. Of those 31 organizations, all but 3 of them are Islamist organizations, right? And now, perhaps if you get your news from Sky or the Murdoch Press, you might think, yeah, of course, they're all Muslim organizations. Only Muslims engage in terrorism. But anyone who has a proper understanding of world affairs knows that terrorism is a form of violence that's utilized by organizations and individuals across the political spectrum. And in fact, the most pervasive users of terrorism are organizations such as the IDF or the US military. But of course, these organizations will never be labeled terrorist organizations, let alone there be any consideration for prescription as terrorist organizations. And that is purely for political reasons, namely that the US and Israel exercise so much influence over our policy, both domestic and foreign, that no politician would ever conceive of doing such a thing. And I think that we have every reason to suspect that is what's going to happen when it comes to hate groups. Yes, the test for a a hate group is ostensibly neutral. Okay, I'm not. I could talk for hours, and I have been this week giving a lot of sort of legal workshops to impacted communities, explaining what the test is for a hate group. It's so convoluted that we could just spend all day speaking about it, and that's really not that necessary, because ultimately the groups that will be prescribed as hate groups are simply the groups that the government wants to have prescribed as hate groups, right? There is this supposedly neutral test of that, there's certain conditions that need to be met. The first condition is that the Minister for the Australian Federal Police needs to be satisfied that a group has engaged in a hate crime. And if you look at a hate crime, yes, they're all neutral. In theory, anyone can commit a hate crime, regardless of your religion, your political ideology, and the in my view, if we look at many of these, for example, Zionist organizations, I think that they arguably would meet the definition of hate groups because they have carried out or have engaged in hate crimes, and the other conditions, in my view, are clearly met. That is, insofar as the test is concerned. But the reality is that the government is never going to prescribe a Zionist organization as a hate group, regardless of what it does, right? And it's for precisely that reason that the pro-Israel lobby in this country championed these laws. If they thought for a moment, if they had one scintilla of a concern that they were going to be prescribed as hate groups, they never would have supported these laws. It's that simple. So yes, I think we should absolutely expect that the groups that will bear the brunt of this new hate group prescription regime will be groups who are engaged in pro-Palestine advocacy and Muslim organizations. Of course, prescription won't be limited to these organizations. They will throw in the occasional far right supremacist organization. How genuine that is, or how much that's just, perhaps a cynical attempt to show that they're not only targeting Muslim or pro-Palestinian organizations, it's difficult to say. But regardless, there will be organizations that are in the future. It won't be limited to pro-Palestinian organizations, and we've seen that over time. Laws that target Muslims in terms of their practical application, that target Muslims or target particular groups, it's just a thin end of the wedge, and it expands. Okay, and we saw that, for example, even with the laws that were introduced, the anti-protest laws that were introduced to target the climate change movement. Right, they're now being used to crack down on protests for all different sorts of causes. Right, and so that's why I think everyone in this country, regardless of your political ideology and regardless of whether or not you support Hezbollah Tahrir or any other organization the government's proposing to prescribe, we have a real interest in opposing this, because the more organizations that they prescribe, the easier it will be to continue to keep expanding the scope, widening the net, and pretty soon it'll be an organization that you support or that you're a member of.
President of Israel, Isaac Herzog, is on his way to Australia. He has made comments that incite genocide. The international courts have put this up. Would this sort of speech fall under any of these laws whatsoever, technically?
Technically, absolutely. I think many, if not most, of the Zionist organizations in this country engage in conduct which I think, on any neutral, impartial interpretation of the new regime, could properly be characterized as a hate crime. And so I think that those groups are certainly eligible to be considered for prescription under the new hate group regime. However, again, it's just never going to happen, right? I mean, he's an official guest of Australia. It's absurd to think that. And we've seen, I think 2 days ago, a complaint was filed urging there to be, I think, an investigation into President Herzog by the Australian Federal Police. And look, I think that there can be useful political purposes of such actions, but from a legal perspective, I mean, it's well, in my view, it's completely futile. And not only futile, sorry, just before you go on, not only is it futile, why again, and I'm not here criticizing any strategy. I think it's so important that we have a broad range of strategies that people are engaged in, and then there also needs to be space within the movement for disagreement. Okay, so I'm not someone here saying, this is what I think, and this is the only way that we should be thinking, or this is my approach, and it's the only correct approach. But personally, it's not making complaints to the Australia Federal Police is not something that I think is a particularly valuable use of my time and resources, because not only because I think that it's futile, as in I don't think that the police will ever act on those complaints, but secondly, it legitimizes the very regime and system that is so antithetical to our fundamental rights.
I see it the way you do. I do think these public demonstrations of dissent are important for certain things, but we can't be naive about it. These systems are designed to repress this sort of stuff, and we should just accept that. Nick, how important is, in terms of Australian democracy on a historical timeline, how important is this case that you're running?
The case on behalf of Palestine Action Group and the Black Caucus to challenge the anti-protest laws?
Yeah. It feels big.
Uh,
No pressure.
I think it'll be a big case for this year. I think it'd be a bit self aggrandizing for me to sit here and tell you how important the case that I'm running is.
Go hard.
But look, I think it's one of many important cases that will be run this year. We are witnessing. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I genuinely believe this is the most aggressive assault on our civil liberties in living memory, and the anti-protest laws that we are challenging is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many laws that have been introduced, not only post Bondi, but post October 2023, almost all of which have been introduced at the urging of the pro-Israel lobby, and all of which seriously undermine our freedom of speech and other civil liberties. And so it is just crucial that we are, as lawyers, that we are challenging these laws. The case that I'm running in the Court of Appeal, challenging the anti-protest laws, is just one of them. And that case is now in for hearing on the 26th of February. I don't know if we'll get a decision on that day, but hopefully soon after, given the urgency of this matter. But yes, it's important. Our right to protest is crucial, and it's a right from which we can protect all of our other rights, right? And sorry, go.
I was just going to say, what concerned Australians that are empathetic and don't like racism do like democracy? What can they do in this moment to support the cause?
There are so many ways that people can support, but I think that generally speaking, just at a higher level, I don't want to be unduly optimistic about our prospects of successfully resisting this onslaught. It's going to be difficult. Okay, I mean, the odds are clearly against us, particularly post Bondi, and I think that people would be justified in feeling a great sense of despair at the moment, but we just can't let that overwhelm us. We have to push back. As I said, I don't think I'm being overly dramatic in saying the future of our democracy is at stake. I'm not either seeking to whitewash, our democracy, of course, especially for First Nations people. I mean, this is not a true democracy, but there are certain important democratic rights that we have traditionally enjoyed in this country, and they are on the line. And so I just don't think that we have the option of giving up. We have to push back. We have to fight. And there are many ways that people can contribute to that. But realistically, it's going to involve organization. Okay. So I just don't think it's enough for you to be on, social media posting or whatever. You have to be involved in the movement. We want to broaden the movement. And as important as I like to think I am on some days, we're really just a very small part of this, the lawyers, like the legal fights, yes, they're important. We may get some victories there, but we'll have some losses as well. But our ability to successfully fight these laws will be dramatically improved or increased if we have popular support, okay, if there's mass mobilization. And I think it's also important for people to understand that the best way of fighting anti-protest laws is through protesting. Okay, in the same way that the best way to combat anti-free speech laws is to continue speaking freely, right? They can't come after all of us. The jails aren't big enough, to put it very crudely, right? And I think it's critical that people understand that, you know, again, I'm not here as a lawyer. I can't be advising people to do anything in contravention of laws. But the objective reality is that the more people that refuse to cower and the more people that continue to speak the truth, the more difficult it's going to be for the government to crack down on people, right? And so, to come back to your question, I think people need to have the courage to do just that, but they also need to be organized, regardless of what that organization is. And it's so important for organizations, individual organizations and groups, to be coming together, not necessarily all into one organization, but forming coalitions in a way that, yes, there has been that trajectory over the past couple of years, but we really need to double down on those efforts, because it's going to take, an extremely effective mass movement in order for us to successfully push back against these laws. These laws were not introduced in a political vacuum. They were introduced as a result of pressure that was brought to bear by certain interest groups, primarily the pro-Israel lobby. Okay, and so if we're going to be able to defeat these laws, we need to be able to do the same. We need to put serious political pressure on the government.
Nick, thank you for all that you do, and thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Dad. Enjoyed it. Bye-bye.